I won't set foot in any city, mall, or even a crowded park again. Seriously, sometimes I can't even muster the courage to step outside my apartment. My family thinks I've lost it. My friends think I'm being overly dramatic. And the cops, they literally told me to stop wasting their time and see a shrink. But I'll tell you exactly what I saw. I'm sure you'll believe me. People need to know about this. It's important. So here's the thing. I traveled about an hour from my home to do some urban exploring in the heart of New York City. I'm not big on city life or anything, but I recently lost my job. I just wanted a change of scenery, maybe even some cool cityscape shots for my Instagram. A little adventure, you know? I parked and just started wandering. I didn't follow a specific route. I made my own. My phone was set to track my path so that I wouldn't get lost. Technology, right? As I was wandering, I got some pretty nice pics of towering skyscrapers, some interesting graffiti, and even a street performer. I was really enjoying myself, making my own way and just breathing. I had been going for almost 2 hours when I saw an old abandoned building. It wasn't too far from me and the entrance was accessible. When I got to the building, I peeked inside and it was pitch black. So I turned on my phone's flashlight, and that's when I realized this was an old warehouse. I got a little carried away thinking about how I had discovered an abandoned warehouse, wondering if anyone else had ever been here. It was thrilling. Of course I stepped in. I went in a few feet. I was being super careful, but I could see a concrete floor beneath me. I felt safe. So I kept walking forward, following the light from my flashlight, taking a picture here and there. I was maybe 20 or 30 feet in when I realized I was in a huge hall, a warehouse hall. There were a few doors in the walls surrounding the hall. I picked the closest one to me and looked in. It was another room. I could tell it was big enough to walk through, so I stepped through the door and carefully walked a few more feet. I heard a rustling sound. I stopped walking, thinking maybe I had disturbed something. I looked all around on the ground and saw nothing. I heard the rustling again. When I raised my phone up to look ahead of me, I saw a figure. Only like not a figure. It was fully clothed in rags and looked really malnourished. It was crouched down on its hands and feet about 4 feet in front of me. It was so pale. Like maybe it had never seen the light of day. Its face was sunken in, and I could clearly see its cheekbones. It had all black eyes, not just the pupils like us, but all black. Between its hands on the ground was a half-eaten rat. I don't want to get too detailed because some people may have weak stomachs. I honestly thought I might hurl. I heard the rustling sound again and realized that it was making that noise. I don't know how I knew, but it was calling for its friends or family. Back up. I don't know. But it was trying to communicate and not with me. I moved back towards the way I came, but I kept my flashlight on it. It didn't seem to like the light too much. It didn't even try to move towards me at all. I was able to get back through the door. I took a quick look around and didn't see anything else. I ran for my life back the way I came. I could hear rustling and it was getting closer and louder. There had to be more than one. I felt like that rat, like I was being hunted. I was able to see the light from the original opening when I tripped. I dropped my phone and I'm not even gonna lie. I didn't even try to pick it up. I got right on up and got out of that building. I ran down those city streets. I was panting so hard, but my adrenaline would not let me stop. I only stopped when I was sure nothing had followed me. I realized I had no phone and no idea where I was. Honestly, I was just happy to be alive. I did eventually find a familiar street and managed to make it back to my car. I went to the local police station, which was pointless. They wouldn't take me seriously, so I just drove home. When I got home, I checked my phone's location. When I used the satellite feature, all I could see was a dense cityscape, no abandoned warehouse. The last time I checked the location of my phone, it had moved over a mile away from the original place I dropped it. It only had about 3% battery left, so I'm sure it has long died. That's what happened. I feel like I could have been eaten. I'm so lucky that I didn't freeze up. I honestly wish I had taken a picture when I first saw that pale figure. I didn't even think about it. All of my other pictures uploaded to the cloud. Anyways, Please, guys, don't go into any abandoned buildings. Back when the whole world was dealing with the pandemic in 2020, my buddy Jake and I both found ourselves without jobs. Our restaurant was forced to close due to lockdowns, and we were stuck at home, just like everyone else. We figured we might as well make the most of the situation, given we didn't really have much else to do. We didn't have any big responsibilities tying us down, so we thought, why not take advantage of the free time? After bouncing ideas around, we decided to take a road trip across the country. We had always wanted to visit every state in the U.S., but never had the time. And now, we had nothing but time. We didn't really have a set route or plan, we just knew we wanted to hit all 50 states. We got some tips from other friends who had taken road trips before and got everything ready. We're from Texas, so we decided to start from there and head west. We had enough provisions for a couple of weeks. Lots of canned goods, some camping gear, and a bunch of snacks. We weren't really trying to rush it. We wanted to take our time, enjoy the journey. We had been cooped up in a kitchen for far too long. The first night we grilled some burgers over a fire. Not the same as a rabbit, but it was what we had, and we loved the idea of cooking our own food outside. We set up our tent in a quiet, secluded spot, and there was a light drizzle that night. But we were dry inside our tent. The next morning, we packed up and got on the road. We covered about 150 miles that day, which was a lot for us. We found a nice spot by a lake to set up camp for the night. We knew there was supposed to be good fishing in that lake. We didn't catch any fish, but we had a good time trying. We turned in early, around 9 p.m., but around midnight we started hearing something moving around outside the tent. It sounded like it was walking on 2 feet. Now, Jake and I have done a lot of camping, so we can usually tell when it's an animal moving around. But this was different. And then we caught a whiff of something. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before. Jake wanted to go out and investigate, but I convinced him it was best to stay put and wait. I was hoping whatever it was would just leave, but the noise continued. Eventually, we decided to take a peek outside. What we saw shocked us. There was a huge, hairy creature poking around our campsite. It was only about 20 feet away. It was standing on 2 feet, but it was definitely not human. I estimated it to be around 7 feet tall. Jake and I just looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. We thought we were done for if that thing decided to come closer. I couldn't figure out what it was. It looked like some sort of giant gorilla or something. It seemed to be sniffing around, then it turned its head towards us. Its eyes were small and dark. The face looked like something prehistoric. Then it made this incredibly loud howling sound. All I could think to do was to fire off a warning shot with our flare gun. As soon as the flare lit up the sky, this creature, whatever it was, took off into the woods, making some kind of guttural noises. I tell you, I've never heard anything like it before. Even thinking about it now gives me the shivers. We didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as daybreak came, we went out to take a look around. We found a path of crushed vegetation leading away from our campsite. And there were these enormous footprints that looked human, but they were way bigger than either of our feet. Jake and I didn't need to discuss it. We both knew it was time to get back to civilization. That encounter had scared the living daylights out of us. We drove until we found a small town. We must have looked like a couple of homeless guys walking into the local diner. After we had eaten and calmed down a bit, we started talking about what we had seen. I was expecting the locals to laugh at us, but they didn't seem all that surprised. Turns out there were quite a few stories about Bigfoot sightings in that area. I was taken back at how nonchalantly they discussed it. We thought about making an official report, but that's when the teasing started. So we decided against it. In the end, we didn't report it. This is actually the first time I've really spoken about it since that day. Sometimes I wonder if we should have just kept going on our road trip, but who knows what that creature could have done to us. As a park ranger, every once in a while you come across a piece of abandoned property. It isn't uncommon. Things get left behind. Things get dumped in the shadowy place where no one thinks they'll be found. Most often, you collect the property, try to contact the owners, and ultimately dispose of it. In some cases, however, you have to do a little more. There are certain items that demand more of you when you find them discarded on the trail. I came across a bicycle one afternoon, adult size, rigged to make easy work of the sharp turns and winding hills of the dirt that cut through the forest. It was overturned on the side of the path. The weeds underneath its steel frame were reaching up from below it, coiling around the body of the bicycle like fingers trying to drag the structure back into the dirt. It had been there a while, I knew that, but aside from the dried mud on the tires, the bike looked brand new. They wouldn't have just left it. I called back to my peers over the radio and began to investigate, stepping over the bike and into the woods. There was a chance they'd left the trail for some reason and become lost, trapped, or injured. I called out, sharing my identity and scanning the brush for any signs of movement. The area became quiet. On the trail, I hadn't noticed it, but the moment I stepped off, it seemed like the ambient sounds of the forest had died down. I think in the moment my adrenaline was too high for my mind to register what was happening. I was too focused on the task at hand, saving a life. When a sound finally did penetrate that wall of silence, though, it wasn't at all what I was looking for. It was a howl, long-winded and bone-chilling. It penetrated straight through the goosebumps rising on my skin and sunk down into my very core. I was suddenly uncomfortably aware of my own heartbeat. I felt every thud in my chest, felt the pulsing in my ears and skull. The howl wasn't like anything I'd heard before. My training took over, my responsibility to the individual who was probably lost in the forest around me. That's what kept me from running, at least at first. Then the creature emerged from the wilderness. It stepped out from behind a tree, as if it had been hiding there and watching me. Its body was long and slender, probably 6 feet from foot to shoulder. It looked like a dog or a wolf, massive and sickly. There were patches where its fur had gone missing, scars where it had tangled with something I can't imagine survived. It was an animal, I knew that much. Then it stood on its hind legs and everything I knew fell apart. It stood like a man and glared at me like I was going to be the next thing stuck between its teeth. I believed it, so I ran. I tore my way back to the trail and lifted the bike from the weeds. I heard the plant life snap, each of the earth's fingers breaking as I ripped the frame back upright. I didn't think I could outrun the monster, but maybe this would work. I pedaled as quickly as I could and prayed that the chain and tires were still properly aligned. If the bike had been discarded as damaged goods, I was doomed. Lucky for me, it was holding up. I was confident that I'd left the monster behind. I was already breathing lighter. I didn't slow down, but I did risk a glance behind me. My eyes didn't even make it that far. It was beside the bike, running full speed, easily in pace with my pedaling, destroying every branch and bush in its way. I tried to yell, gasp, anything. I opened my mouth to scream, but it was already crashing into me. It slammed shoulder first into my side and sent me reeling. My face hit the ground first. I tasted dirt and grass and the blood already flowing between my teeth. My body ragdolled and rolled, tying up in knots before I landed several feet off of the trail. I was face up, squinting at the sky peeking back at me from beyond the tops of the trees. I knew surer than anything else that the monster was coming my way. I was going to be eaten, but the bite never came. The teeth and tongue never lashed my body. I was able to pull myself up somehow. The bike was ruined. The second crash on the trail was apparently too much for it to bear. The frame was twisted and the front tire was bent. There was no sign of my attacker except for the patch of hair caught on the bicycle spokes. I grabbed that, thinking it would be my saving grace. It would prove that I wasn't crazy. More important, at least at the time, I thought it would be enough evidence to encourage the rest of the rangers to search for the original owner of the bike. When I brought it back and told my story, there were some snickers, but they ultimately decided to test the hair to see where it came from. The last thing I expected was for those results to come back human. The texture was all wrong, and I knew the beast I'd seen wasn't anything close to human. How was it possible then? How could that have been the evidence that peeled off of the beast's body? It didn't make sense to me then, and it doesn't make sense to me now. Unfortunately, the rangers felt the same way. Efforts to find the missing person, if they even existed, were minimal. Efforts to track the monsters were non-existent. It was never found and thus far never seen again. But what do you think? Is there a chance it turns back up? Is there a chance that the thing I saw was really just a man? I want to share a peculiar incident that occurred to my sister and me last weekend. We reside in the quaint town of Ballycastle, Northern Ireland, and we had ventured out to the local Tesco on a Saturday evening to gather some groceries for the week. As we were returning home, we were traversing one of the lesser-known lanes, and our old car began to falter. It's an ancient thing, but we just don't have the means to replace it yet. We were hoping it would last a bit longer, considering the road we were on was quite secluded, and I certainly didn't fancy the idea of walking a few kilometers in my new stilettos. But alas, fortune wasn't on our side, and the blasted vehicle came to a halt. Thankfully, my sister Maeve managed to guide it to the side of the road as it gave out, so at least we weren't obstructing the path. By the time our car had given up the ghost, it was Saturday night, and our chances of finding a tow service were slim, unless we opted for one of those round-the-clock services, which cost a small fortune. As for local garages, we have O'Brien's and Gallagher's, but they're both closed on Saturdays. Ballycastle is a small place after all. I know some might suggest we should have roadside assistance. That would indeed be ideal, but lately we're barely managing to keep the lights on. Regardless, we were stuck, and sometimes you just have to roll with the punches. I knew Maeve didn't want to call anyone we knew for assistance, as it seemed like we were constantly asking for help these days. The pandemic really threw us for a loop, and now all we can find are odd jobs. So we began our trek. Maeve seemed optimistic that a car would pass by eventually, and we wouldn't have to walk the entire distance. She might have been trying to keep my spirits up. As we were walking along the edge of the road, there's a stretch of dense forest before it opens up to a meadow. As we were trudging along next to the forest, I started getting this eerie sensation that something was in there, observing us. I kept glancing towards the trees, and Maeve noticed and asked me what was bothering me. I felt a bit foolish, but I told her, and she chuckled and told me not to fret. It's not like there's anything large enough to harm us where we live. She was correct in terms of wildlife. Badgers, foxes, rabbits, and deer aren't exactly menacing. But I was unnerving myself, considering it might be a person, which is entirely illogical given we were in the middle of nowhere, right? Well, I was correct, and there was something there. We both heard a rustling behind us, and we turned around to look. There was something standing in the middle of the road. I asked, "Is that a person?" Because it was tall enough to be one. We couldn't see it clearly, but it didn't resemble a human shape. It was upright on two legs, but the upper body appeared to be triangular. Maeve said, "I haven't the foggiest what that is. Let's move." She quickened her pace, which made me quite anxious because she's usually unflappable. So, I'm trying to walk faster and my feet are really aching. I keep looking behind us, and even though I never saw it move, somehow this entity seemed closer every time I glanced back. I was genuinely starting to panic. Maeve must have noticed it was getting closer too. Suddenly she stopped and turned around, shouting, "Oi!" really loud, as if she was trying to frighten it off. I turned around too to see, and this thing was maybe 20 meters behind us. I'm not the best at estimating distances. But right after Maeve shouted, it suddenly moved and its upper body expanded, and I swear on my life, this thing had actual wings. These enormous wings unfurled all of a sudden to what seemed to be 3 meters wide. It then gave a little hop and pushed the wings down, and it just took off. There's no other way to describe it. It just launched itself like a bird, even though it was the size of a man. It didn't come toward us, just up and up until it vanished off to the side of the road where the forest was. Maeve said, "Bloody hell," and I was just speechless. I mean, I've never been so frightened in my life. The only thing I could think was that maybe it was a fallen angel, but that's just my Catholic upbringing, I suppose. And anyway, this thing was dark, maybe even black, which wouldn't match an angel. I don't really believe in fallen angels. But then again, this thing was man-shaped and man-sized, and it was able to fly. I pulled out my phone right then, ready to call my cousin and plead with her to come get us. We don't really get along, and I didn't want to ask her for help, but I was just terrified. Maeve grabbed my arm and said, "We have to keep moving." So here I am trying to dial the number and keep up the pace, and I couldn't get the call to go through. It rang a few times, but the signal must have been weak because it kept dropping the call. I gave up and just focused on walking as fast as I could. Maeve looked behind us real quick, and I asked her if the thing had returned. I was too scared to look. She said no, but we kept up our pace. Then we saw some headlights, even though they were going in the wrong direction we wanted to go, coming toward us and not heading toward town. Maeve said, "Let's cross and flag him down." I guess she was as spooked as me. I knew I would go just about anywhere to get away from here. So we crossed the road, and it was a large lorry. Maeve waved her arms, and thank God the driver stopped. We got in, and Maeve said we just needed to go somewhere, anywhere, it didn't matter where. She just told the driver we broke down. She didn't mention the thing with wings because she probably thought the driver would kick us out, thinking we were mad. So the driver was really understanding and said, sure, he'd drop us at the next village. I figured if there was any place open, we could just hang out and decide what to do from there. We had only been traveling for about 5 minutes when all of a sudden, the lorry's headlights illuminated this thing ahead of us, standing right in the middle of the road. The driver cursed and hit the horn, but the thing stayed right in the middle of the road till we got really close. The driver hit his brakes and blew the horn again, and the headlight beam shone right on the creature. It was all black except its face, which was gray. It was happening so fast I can't say for sure, but I didn't see a face on it, just red eyes in the headlights right before it took off. I know it was the same thing that had been behind us, because it unfolded these big black wings and shot straight up, flying right over the damn windshield. The driver swerved, exclaiming, "What was that?" And I held on to Maeve with a death grip, afraid we were going to jackknife and crash. The driver got it under control, though. But he must have been pretty shaken up because he pulled off to the side of the road and sat gripping the steering wheel and breathing fast. That's when my sister told him that thing had been following us. The driver had no choice but to believe us then because he'd seen it with his own eyes. He pulled back on the road and we talked about it all the way to the next village. Sean, the driver, said he'd never seen anything like it before, but a driver friend of his had a similar experience, and based on that, he thought it was the Mothman. Maeve and I decided together to write you this letter, since you know about stuff like this. No one in our town would ever believe us. Do you know if anyone's ever been hurt by a Mothman? Just wondering why it was following us, and what would have happened if we hadn't gotten away. This was a few summers back when I had gone to visit my cousin's place. We lived in a quaint village in southern Spain. My cousin had just learned to ride a bike, but his father had already confiscated it for not adhering to some rule. So we were really bored and there wasn't anything we felt like doing, so we decided to walk to the small market square. The walk there was quite lengthy. We had to cross some cobblestone streets and follow a narrow alleyway. By the time we got there, it was getting late. It was the weekend, and we thought we might run into someone we knew. We browsed through a couple of the stalls, but there was nothing interesting, so we went over to the little plaza. You know how it is when you're a kid and everything just seems dull. We were sitting on the fountain edge, and I spotted 2 local police cars parked at the end of the market square near this old bakery. My cousin thought they were probably searching for 2 boys who had been stealing fruits from the local orchards. We decided to start heading back since it was almost like 10 p.m. at that point, and I wasn't looking forward to the long walk back through the narrow streets and cobblestones in the dark. So we were walking past the bakery, about to turn the corner, and I heard a drone. My cousin thought it was a police drone looking for the fruit thieves. I highly doubted they would go so far as to use a drone for such a minor crime. But I started to feel worried that the police might mistake us for the fruit thieves they were looking for. We were walking across the street from the police cars, and I tried not to act suspicious even though we hadn't done anything wrong. We rounded the corner, and we came to the vast vineyard behind the market square. At the end of the vineyard, there are these dense olive groves. And it was at the boundary of the vineyard and the olive groves that we saw something peculiar. It was like a massive disc-like object that was floating there in midair. It was hovering just above the olive trees. It's kind of hard to describe it accurately, but it was like two discs stacked on top of each other, with the upper one slightly extending to the right and the lower one to the left. Both ends had these blue lights that were glowing and pulsing. Maybe it was because it was so dark, but the glowing seemed like it spread over a really large area. The object was enormous, and its shape seemed incompatible for an airborne object. I was completely bewildered by the scene in front of me. I could still hear the sound of a drone, but I didn't see any sign of one. Instead, I found myself staring at this impossible object suspended in midair. My cousin, who I knew wasn't really a believer in UFOs or aliens, was still insisting that it was some kind of police drone looking for the fruit thieves, which in my mind sounded more gullible than believing in UFOs, for God's sake. I mean, if we had drones like that, I'm pretty sure it would be top secret and not floating around in a vineyard. It was definitely not a drone. Its shape was just a disc without wings or propellers. The fact that it was so huge and was able to stay suspended in mid-air was inexplicable. And it was positioned at an odd angle. I remember the next part clearly. I lifted my phone up to take a picture, and the object suddenly started spinning toward us. It was totally surreal. It spun really fast, like it was a propeller itself. You could hear the sound of the wind as it was cutting through the air. I was completely stunned. My mind was struggling to make sense of what was happening. It was like the object was responding to my phone. My cousin started panicking and pushed my hands down. Then the spinning motion immediately stopped, and the object began to reposition itself, lifting up a little and started to move toward the market square. I have to tell you, the drone sound hadn't been coming from the object. The drone we heard had appeared in front of the disc-shaped object, almost like it was escorting it away. The drone didn't look like a conventional one, though. Maybe it was because I was on the verge of hysteria, but it seemed to have a distorted shape and its lights were unusually bright. The lights were on inside it, which I thought was really weird for a drone flying around in the dark. I can't emphasize enough how unsettling the whole situation was. The object and the drone were hovering right above us, and it felt like we were in the middle of something that could be catastrophic. The sound of the drone blades was deafening, and the size of the object was mind-boggling. My cousin kept trying to rationalize it as some sort of police drone, but I knew deep down that it was not of this world. The way it moved, the lights, the sound, everything about it was just so strange and otherworldly. When you see something that doesn't fit into any category you know, it's like your brain just can't process it. My brain didn't know what to do with this information, and it was incredibly unnerving. It was like everything I thought I knew about the world was being questioned. But all we could do after all that was to just walk away. I looked back a few times, but then we both just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. It's strange to think that I used to think a close encounter would be cool, but after that experience, I don't ever want to go through something like that again. I've been a park ranger at the Redwood National and State Parks for over 10 years now. I've seen my fair share of oddities, strange tracks, unexplainable noises, even a few glimpses of creatures that didn't quite fit the usual fauna. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I've been experiencing lately. It all began a few weeks ago. I was out on my usual patrol, the moon casting long, eerie shadows between the towering redwoods. I'd always loved the forest at night, the way it seemed to come alive with a different kind of energy. But that night, something felt off. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures was strangely muted, replaced by an unsettling silence. As I made my way along the trail, I noticed something unusual. A series of large footprints, unlike any I'd seen before. They were vaguely humanoid, but far too large to be human. And the claws. They were unlike any creature I knew of in these woods. I felt a shiver of unease, but I pushed it aside, attributing it to the strange atmosphere. A few nights later, I saw it. I was on a late patrol, the forest bathed in an ethereal glow from the full moon. I was nearing the edge of a clearing when I saw a figure in the distance. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in a thick, matted fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Its muscular form was hunched, as if it was not used to standing upright. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I took in the sight. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow, met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a primal fear, a fear of a predator. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving only the echo of a low growl and the rustle of undergrowth. I reported what I'd seen to the other rangers, but they dismissed it, attributing it to the shadows and my overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it was real. I could still feel its gaze on me, a predator sizing up its prey. A few nights later, my suspicions were confirmed. I was returning from a late patrol when I noticed a light on in one of the cabins. As I approached, I saw them, my fellow rangers, carrying a gurney into the cabin. I had no idea why they would do that, and especially why they would at night. I asked them about it on my next shift, and they all dismissed it and blew me off. It was really weird. I've been watching the other rangers closely, trying to pick up on any signs of deceit. They're good people. I've worked with them for years, but there's a tension in the air now. A secret being kept. I can't shake the feeling that they know more about the creature than they're letting on. I've been patrolling more frequently, especially at night. I'm drawn to the forest, to the mystery it's hiding. One night I decided to stake out the cabin where I'd seen the gurney. I hid in the underbrush, the cool night air sending shivers down my spine. Hours passed, the forest alive with the sounds of the night. Just as I was about to give up and head back, I saw a light flicker on in the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the door slowly open. 2 of my fellow rangers emerged, their faces obscured by the darkness. Between them, they were carrying another gurney. My breath hitched as I saw the figure on it, large, covered in a sheet, unmistakably the creature. I watched as they loaded the gurney into a van and drove off, leaving me alone in the darkness. I felt a mix of fear and determination. I knew I had to follow them, to uncover the truth. I trailed the van at a safe distance, my mind racing. Where were they taking the creature? Why were they hiding it? The drive seemed to last forever, but finally we arrived at a secluded facility on the outskirts of the park. I watched as they unloaded the gurney and disappeared inside. I waited until the coast was clear, then made my way to the facility. I had to know what was going on. I found a window and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The creature was there, alive but restrained. Scientists in lab coats were gathered around it, taking notes and discussing in hushed tones. I knew then that I had to do something. I couldn't let this continue. I retreated back into the forest, my mind whirling with plans and possibilities. I had to expose the truth, for the sake of the creature and the integrity of the park. I've started gathering evidence, documenting everything I can. I've set up a hidden camera, and I'm keeping a close eye on the other rangers and the facility. I'm not sure what I'll find, or what I'll do when I find it, but I know I can't stand by and do nothing. I'll keep you updated on what I find. But for now, remember, not everything in the forest is as it seems. And sometimes the real monsters are not the creatures in the shadows, but the ones hiding in plain sight. I've been tuning into your channel for a bit now. I've always been intrigued by your stories, how they all seem to be these random encounters with the supernatural. But let me tell you about my own experience. You could call me a researcher, I suppose, but I'm no academic. I'm just a regular guy who's always had a fascination with the unexplained. I've spent the better part of my life chasing after these mysteries, and it took me 20 years until I had the encounter I'm about to share with you. I was on a trip with my son, visiting Louisiana. We were exploring the swamps, far away from the hustle and bustle of New Orleans. We'd heard rumors of a strange creature lurking in these parts, something the locals referred to as the rougarou. Now, I'm not one to believe in tall tales, but there was something about these stories that piqued my interest. We'd been out in the swamps for a few days following up on these rumors. We hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary, just the usual swamp wildlife. But then, one evening, things took a turn. We were sitting by our campfire just about to turn in for the night when we heard a rustling in the undergrowth. Now, I've been camping enough times to know the sounds of the night, but this was different. It was heavier, slower, like something big was moving around out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the noise. For a moment, all we saw were the shadows of the trees. But then, something moved. Something big. It was just a silhouette, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I could see it was tall, standing on two legs with broad shoulders. It looked more like a man than any animal I'd ever seen. My son was scared, I could tell, but I told him to stay quiet, to stay still. We watched as the creature moved slowly around our camp, always staying just out of the light. It circled us a few times, then disappeared back into the swamp. We didn't sleep much that night, as you can imagine. The next day we were on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had us jumping. But the swamp was quiet, eerily so. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the next evening, out of the silence, we heard it. A low growl, guttural and primal. It sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight again, my hand shaking just a bit. I shone the light towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was again. The creature. It was closer now, close enough for us to make out details. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as the night around us. Its eyes reflected the light from my flashlight, glowing an eerie yellow. It had a snout like a dog or a wolf, but its body was more human-like. Muscular arms ended in clawed hands, and its posture was hunched, as if it was ready to pounce. I knew it was the rougarou, the creature from the stories. Seeing it up close in the flesh was both terrifying and fascinating. It was a creature of legend, a myth come to life, and it was standing right in front of us. The rougarou didn't make any aggressive moves. It just watched us, its eyes never leaving ours. It was almost as if it was curious, studying us just as we were studying it. We were in its territory, guests in its home, and it was deciding what to do with us. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. It turned and disappeared into the swamp, leaving us alone in the silence once more. We were left with the crackling of our fire and the pounding of our hearts. We didn't speak of it for the rest of the trip. It was as if we were both trying to process what we had seen, to make sense of it. But there was no making sense of it. We had come face to face with a legend, with a creature that shouldn't exist. But it did. We had seen it with our own eyes. That encounter changed us, changed how we saw the world. It was a reminder that there are still mysteries out there, still things that defy explanation. And as terrifying as it was, I wouldn't change a thing. It was an experience, a story that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I had an encounter in Oregon. My name is Samuel, and about 5 years ago, I was a bachelor living just outside of Bend, Oregon. Anyone familiar with that area probably knows about the Deschutes National Forest nearby, as well as several additional state parks. I had moved to Bend from New York to follow my dream of becoming a wildlife photographer, but it ended up being more challenging than I thought. I was living in a small cabin in a remote area, and my nearest neighbor was actually a lumber mill, so I didn't have anyone to interact with regularly. Sometimes I would call my brother back home to chat. He was married with a few kids of his own, or I'd spend a while talking to the delivery guy, usually an older man named Hank, who would come down my long driveway to deliver packages. With a little less than a month to go until I could move back home, autumn started creeping up. The leaves were changing colors and falling, and after a few days I was able to calm down and enjoy the peace. So, one evening I was packing up the majority of my studio except for necessities. The cabin was surrounded by fir trees, so we were covered in shade relatively early in the evening, and it also got dark faster in our area. I had just started putting away a set of expensive camera equipment when I heard what sounded like a branch hitting a window. I stopped to listen, but I found it hard to concentrate as my dog Max started barking. I walked over to quiet him down and heard the sound again, a little thudding sound like a branch hitting glass and bouncing off. It was coming from the direction of the living room. Immediately I stiffened up. After all, I was living alone in this cabin with a dog in an area I didn't really like. The nearest person would hopefully respond if I needed. The lights were off in the living room, so I just stuck my head into the room and looked at the windows quickly. As I glanced around, a branch bounced off the far window and I jerked back into the studio. Probably just a deer playing around, I tried to convince myself, but knew there weren't any deer in the area. Max, my dog, didn't seem bothered by what was happening, and I went back to him, petting him as if he was the one who needed comforting. For a few minutes it was quiet, and I was just starting to catch my breath when I heard the garage door rattle. It was one of those big wooden doors that you have to pull down over the carport. I ran to the studio window and looked out into the driveway, where the light clearly outlined something walking around. At first, I thought I was looking at someone in a Halloween costume. It looked like a Bigfoot getup, but I realized quickly that it was too realistic, not loose like I would expect a costume to be. What I was looking at was a large ape-like creature standing on its hind legs. I could only watch as it moved around the side of the garage and made another banging sound. It must have been hitting the side of the garage for some reason. As soon as I couldn't see it anymore, I went and grabbed Max and headed upstairs, where I could look down on the front yard out of the bedroom window. We stayed up there for maybe 10 minutes before I heard a vehicle come down the driveway. It was the delivery truck with headlights on, and I held Max tightly as I ran back downstairs to meet Hank. I didn't open the screen door right away, and he looked confused, waiting on the porch. "Hey," I said to him breathlessly, and then explained what had happened. He listened without interrupting, only turning once to look at the garage door, which was closed. When I finished, he stepped off the porch and went to the garage. I warned him to be careful. He took his phone out, took a few photos, and came back to the house to show me through the screen door. The photos were of footprints. I can only describe them as really big footprints. If I spread my hand out, they were larger than that, and 5-toed. Hank could tell how freaked out I was and started to explain to me about the supposed Bigfoot sightings in the area. I hadn't heard of them before. This wasn't any kind of legend I'd heard back home. He told me that there were a few reports every year, and they were really similar to mine. Bigfoot coming to remote houses and messing with things, never hurting anyone, but always doing something to scare people. The banging on the garage and throwing branches was pretty standard. He told me that if I hadn't gone upstairs, I probably would have seen it looking through the first-floor windows at me. All I can say is, I'm happy I didn't. I probably would have had a heart attack. A few weeks later, as planned, I moved back east to a much more populated area about 10 minutes away from my brother. Max is 7 now, and every now and then I wonder if I should tell him this story when he's older. But I think he's like me, and it would probably mess with him more than help. Anyway, there is no reason for him to really know about it. My dream is still in Oregon and will probably stay there. I often wonder if it's encountered anything. Doesn't really matter though, because there is no way I'd be willing to go back down there. My encounter isn't something I'd want to experience again. I've got a tale for you that's going to make your hair stand on end. I am not the only one who's seen things that don't make a lick of sense. So I was up in the Appalachian Mountains. Just a regular guy, taking a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. I am not a believer in ghosts or goblins, but what I saw up there, well, it shook me to my core. I was sleeping in this little cabin I'd rented, nestled right in the heart of the mountains. It was quiet, peaceful, and I felt safe. That was until I heard this weird noise outside my window. Sounded like scratching, like something was trying to get in. I got up to check it out, and that's when I saw it. This creature was right outside my window. It was pale, with long arms and fingers that ended in claws. Its eyes were like two black holes, and it had this twisted grin on its face. It was like something out of a nightmare, a mix of man and beast, and it was staring right at me. I was shocked just staring back at this thing. And then all of a sudden, it lunged through the window, landing right in the middle of my cabin. I fell back and it gave me this weird look before jumping back out the window. I was too scared to move, too shocked to call for help. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with this creature. It was gone, but the mess it left behind was proof enough that it had been there. My window was shattered, glass everywhere. And then I heard another window break. It was back, and it was inside my cabin. I could hear it moving around, and I knew it was coming for me. I managed to slam my bedroom door shut just as it reached for me. I could hear it clawing at the door, its breathing heavy and ragged. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I could barely get the words out, but the dispatcher could hear the fear in my voice and sent help. The clawing eventually stopped, and I heard the creature leave. When the cops showed up, they found me huddled in a corner, shaking like a leaf. They searched the cabin, but there was no sign of the creature. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They suggested it might have been a burglar, but I knew the truth. After doing some research, I found out that the creature I saw was called the rake. It's a paranormal entity that's been around for centuries, preying on people and leaving them traumatized. I found out that I wasn't the only one who'd seen it, and that gave me some comfort. Since that night, I've done everything I can to protect myself. I've put extra locks on my doors and windows, and I always keep a weapon close by. I still have nightmares about that night, and I know I'll never fully recover from the trauma. But I'm not going to let the rake control my life. I'm going to keep fighting, keep moving forward, and keep sharing my story. In the weeks that followed, I found comfort in the stories of others who'd survived encounters with the rake. We formed a sort of community, sharing our experiences and supporting each other through the fear and uncertainty. Looking back, I feel lucky to be alive. The rake is a creature that most folks never come across, and from what I've read, those who do don't often live to tell the tale. But in a weird way, I'm grateful for the experience. It's made me more aware of the dangers that could be lurking out there, and it's given me a new appreciation for life. My name is Andrew, and I have an extraordinary tale to share about an encounter I had in the Grand Canyon National Park. I was on a rafting trip with my friends, a tradition we've had for years. This year, the Grand Canyon was our chosen destination, and it was a bright afternoon when the incident occurred. We had left on our journey from a launch point at the top of the river. I remember the air was crisp, and the sound of the rushing water was a constant companion. We navigated the river's twists and turns, each bend revealing more of the park's breathtaking beauty. As we were maneuvering through a particularly challenging rapid, my eyes were scanning the surroundings. I've always been fascinated by wildlife, always on the lookout for something unusual. And I was about to come across something truly remarkable. We reached a calm stretch of the river, and I steered us towards a sandy bank for a break. As I was securing the raft, I glanced up towards the canyon walls, and suddenly, I froze, perched on a ledge. About 100 feet above us was a creature that resembled a bird, but was the size of a human. It was colossal. And as I squinted, I could make out the face of an eagle and glossy black feathers and broad, powerful wings. But its eyes were sharp and intelligent, and it stood on two legs, much like a human. Instinctively, I moved towards it, leaving the others behind. For some reason, I was being drawn closer. However, once I got close enough to see it clearly, fear gripped me. But as I scrutinized the creature, I realized that it didn't seem hostile or dangerous. In fact, it looked just as startled to see us as we were to see it. As I stood there, gazing at the creature in astonishment and disbelief, I couldn't help but marvel at its immense size. It must have been at least 6 feet tall, its silhouette stark against the canyon wall. Its body was covered in sleek, dark feathers, which contrasted sharply with the red and orange hues of the canyon. Its muscular wings were folded at its sides, spanning an impressive length. My heart pounded with fear. The legends I had heard about thunderbirds flashed through my mind. But as I observed the creature more closely, I noticed that it had a regal expression in its large, golden eyes. It seemed curious rather than threatening. The creature spread its wings, a slow, deliberate movement that was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. I held my breath, unsure of how it would react. To my surprise, it didn't take flight. Instead, it remained perched on the ledge, tilting its head slightly as if trying to understand our presence. I decided to take a step back, hoping to show that we meant no harm. To my relief, the creature mirrored my movement, retracting its wings slightly. It was as if it understood my intentions and didn't want to provoke us. We continued this silent exchange, each of us observing the other. It was a surreal experience, like being part of a silent dialogue between two beings from different worlds. I felt a sense of connection, a bond formed through our mutual curiosity. Time seemed to stand still as we remained locked in our gaze. The river around us was tranquil, as if holding its breath, creating an atmosphere of enchantment and mystery. It felt like I had stumbled into a different world, a place where mythical creatures were real. Despite the fear still simmering within me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder. I was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that most people could only dream of. But as much as I wanted to stay and delve deeper into the encounter, a part of me knew it was time to retreat. With a final glance at the creature, I slowly turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. I made my way back to where my friends were still lounging by the raft, my mind racing with a mix of emotions. I couldn't wait to share my encounter with them, to describe in vivid detail what I had just experienced. They could see the truth in my eyes. I recounted every detail, from the creature's appearance to our silent communication. They listened intently, hanging on to every word. Some were amazed, while others remained skeptical. Then, as a group, we all continued down the river, but despite all of us looking around, we found no further signs of the creature. The rest of the day passed by in a blur, a mix of thrilling rapids and laughter with my friends. We concluded our rafting trip as planned, reaching our campsite just as the sun began to set. Emotionally, each friend had a different response to my unexpected encounter. Some felt a sense of wonder and gratitude, while others felt a lingering unease, a reminder of the unknown lurking within the depths of the canyon. But we all agreed that it was a day we would never forget. And for me, a day that had affected me deeper than I ever could have imagined. All right, here we go. I am not one to get spooked easily. Maybe that's just me being full of myself, but it's the truth. Being in the military kind of grounds you, you know? Shows you what you're made of. Teaches you when to be scared and when not to be. About a month back, I definitely had a good reason to be scared. Unless I was just hallucinating the whole dang day, I can't make heads or tails of what I saw. I've been fishing every season since I hung up my military boots. That's a decade now. Bass, catfish, trout, I've caught them all. And I eat what I catch. I am not a trophy fisherman. You probably wouldn't even know I was a fisherman if you just dropped by my place on a lazy afternoon. I don't keep fishing magazines on the coffee table. My tackle box is stashed away in the garage, out of sight and out of reach. I don't talk about fishing. It's my alone time. Out there, away from the hustle and bustle with a fishing rod in my hands, it's kind of soothing usually. About a month ago, that peace and quiet went out the window. I had recently moved my fishing spot from its usual place in the Florida Keys. I set it up about 20 miles towards the mainland in the Florida swamps. I just wanted a change of scenery. Looking back, that might not have been the best idea because something found me out there. Despite all the camouflage and concealment, something picked up my scent and came right for me. It was hunting me like a gator on a duck. I was sitting in my little boat, all cozy and unprepared. It probably thought I was an easy meal. If I'd been any less lucky that day, I probably would have been eaten. I didn't hear it coming. That's a bit embarrassing, but I didn't. I only saw it when it emerged from the swamp and slithered into the clearing. It was huge. At first, I thought it was an alligator, but its scales were too long, too thick and wild. When I aimed my fishing spear in its direction, I saw the beast for what it was. A snake, I think. A snake larger than any creature I've seen in North America. It was looking right at me. It was looking at me and hissing. Hungry, I could tell. I was shocked. I was appropriately afraid. My fishing spear was not the kind of weapon designed to take out creatures of that size. It kept coming toward the boat. I gripped my spear tighter, just in case I'd have to jab to keep the beast moving. The base of my boat was a few feet off the water. When that thing got close and reared up, its head was level with the edge of the boat. I jabbed it. And it didn't flinch. It hissed and thrashed, almost annoyed, and it attacked the boat itself. It could have slithered up there, I bet. It could have joined me in the boat and had me cornered. I don't know why it didn't. Maybe it was just toying with me. Maybe I ticked it off and it wanted to tick me off right back. It tore through the boat in seconds. The next thing I knew, the entire boat was capsizing. I fell into the water and went tumbling with it. I hit the water hard, lost my breath. Most of the boat collapsed right on top of the snake or the gator or whatever the heck it was. To this day, I still don't know what it was. Luckily, the weight of the boat knocked it down. Disoriented it. The bottle of fish attractant I had with me busted open. The scent must have hit that animal like a whirlwind. It thrashed at the splintered remains of the boat and gave me just enough time to swim. I made it to the shore with my spear in hand. I knew I couldn't outswim it. It was only a matter of time before it picked up my scent again. I turned around and used a tree to steady my aim. I was still pretty shaken from the fall. I waited. I held my breath and I waited, not moving. I watched the snake thing rake its tail through the water, searching for the source of the enticing odor. When its tail came up empty, it started to look around again. I watched as it reared up again and realized a horrifying truth. Its body sat just as naturally upright as it did on all fours. It didn't struggle to hold its balance at all. It spotted me again. It hissed, and it slithered toward me, this time moving on the surface of the water. Luck found me again at that moment. If the snake hadn't reared up, I would have been aiming at its back and its tail. On its hind end, though, I could get to its underbelly. I could get to somewhere important. When I jabbed this time, it hissed. I screamed with every ounce of air in my lungs. I screamed until I was empty. It must have been enough. I watched the snake turn around and flee in the other direction. I waited again. I knew I had to. I had to make sure that it wasn't circling around me, trying to approach from the flank. It took me hours to make it back to my truck. Every sound and movement put me on edge. I don't scare easy. At least I didn't used to. The more time that passes between that encounter and now, the more I want to know what that animal was. I'll tell you one thing, though. I'm not willing to go back to get those answers. I'm built for a lot of things, but fishing for that creature is not one of them. At least I can take my fishing rod anywhere else in the world. That monster thing, it can have the Florida swamps. I'm a Pittsburgh native and I have a story that I think you'll be interested in. So, I work at the local children's museum as an educator. I put on programs for the kids, craft demonstrations, and things like that. It's pretty fun. I spend a lot of my working hours interacting with children under the age of 10. I started noticing things because the kids were acting weird. I had a group of preschoolers for one of our hour-long workshops. I couldn't keep their attention, which happens sometimes, not very often, but it happens. What concerned me this time was that they all kept huddling in the same corner of the room. They faced the wall and would just flail their arms around, like they were waving to someone I couldn't see. I was worried that some of the smaller kids could get hurt, so I went to break them up. When I got in that corner, I felt a chill pass through me. I assumed it was an overhead draft or something and figured I would tell my manager later. But the thing is, I had several lessons in that exhibition area, and each time the same thing would happen. The kids would all choose the same corner to pack into, and they'd start waving and trying to climb up the walls. Whenever I tried to move them, I felt a blast of cold come out of nowhere. It creeped me out, to be honest. And again, I work with really little kids. They're hard enough to wrangle on a good day. I finally asked one of the 6-year-olds what game they were playing. She said it wasn't a game. They just wanted to play with the lady in the corner. And this threw me off because aside from myself and my aide, there were no other adults in the room. I asked her if she could describe this lady or if she had a name. I thought it was a simple enough question. The girl said she didn't have a name and that her skin was gray. That was all she could tell me. So I played along just to get through the workshop. My aide wanted to tell our boss about it, or even the parents, but I wasn't convinced it was that bad. It's not like the kids were hurting each other or damaging anything. I honestly think I would have kept ignoring it if things had stayed that way. But then we had an incident. I was keeping my eye on one of the boys because he had gone into the corner with the other kids and was acting sort of jumpy. I thought he might have been getting overwhelmed. I was just about to pull him aside when he slid backwards across the floor. It was like someone had grabbed the back of his shirt and dragged him along. The boy was giggling, but I was terrified. An invisible hand had just pulled him clear across the room. There was no ignoring that. Plus, my aide had seen it too. He looked just as scared as I was. Which made me feel better, honestly. Otherwise, I would have thought I'd gone crazy for a second. I took the boy out of the room and looked him over. He seemed fine, and it's not like I could take him to my supervisor as proof the place was haunted. So instead, I marched him over to a different activity group. I told one of the other educators that he wasn't fitting in with my group of kids, and she accepted that explanation. Easy. Which left me the task of figuring out how to corral a group of kids away from the ghost in the room. It was my aide that started to call the thing a ghost. I didn't want to think about being in the room with someone's dead spirit. The only solution I could come up with was sectioning off that corner of the room with a bunch of tables and chairs. I told the kids it was a fort, and that anyone who got through the rest of the workshop without disturbing it would get a sticker. Thankfully, that was enough to get them to listen. I wish I'd thought of that earlier. Anyway, me and my aide got through the rest of the lesson without incident. We got our next batch of kids and kept the fort up. There wasn't much time for us to discuss what had happened until the end of the day. We were one of the last couple of people to finish up, and we had to do a sweep of the building. We debated whether to tell our supervisor or if there was even a way to explain it. I figured that I had been willing to brush it off until I saw something truly strange. Why would our boss be any different? He admitted that I had a point. And it wasn't like we could close off that exhibition area. It was one of our largest rooms. When we circled back to the room and started to take down the fort, I felt that chill again. It made me more anxious than it had before. I just wanted to pack up and leave. I was scared of what would happen if the thing tried to grab me. I was trying to work as quickly as possible, and all of a sudden I couldn't move. I was just standing there, shivering, locked into a standing position. I don't know why. I tried to raise my arms or call for my aide across the room, but I couldn't. It was like someone else had locked down my body. I was frozen like that for at least a minute before I could move again. My heart rate was going crazy. I bolted to the front of the building and stayed there until my aide finished cleaning up. It was hard to come into work the next day. But I think the spirit left. The kids went back to normal. There was no more huddling. I hope the ghost stays gone, although I am worried that it's just waiting for another dull moment or went looking for someone else to freak out. Benny and I, we were both working this boring corporate job. Then came 2019, the year that recession hit. We were both laid off, just like that. We didn't have any major obligations, and we thought, why not take this opportunity to do something we've always wanted to do? So we decided to go on a road trip. You know, the classic American road trip, Route 66, the whole shebang. We packed up Benny's old truck with enough food and camping gear for 2 weeks. We started our journey from Chicago, looking forward to exploring the open road. It was exhilarating, escaping from the corporate jungle to the actual wilderness. 3 days into our journey, we decided to camp for the night in Oklahoma. We found a cozy spot next to a lake, set up our tent, and started a fire. We even caught a few fish from the lake and roasted them over the fire. I got to tell you, those were some of the best tasting fish I've ever had. The night was calm, and there was a slight breeze. We got into our tent and crashed. But around midnight, we heard something weird. It sounded like something, or someone was outside our tent, and trust me, it didn't sound like any animal we knew. Benny, brave as always, wanted to go out and check. I told him to hold up, maybe whatever it was would just go away. But the noise kept getting louder and closer. Then we did it. We unzipped the tent just a crack to peek outside. And what we saw, man, it was like something out of a horror movie. This hulking, hairy figure was moving around our campfire. It was on 2 legs like a man, but it was no man. It was at least 7 feet tall. We were frozen with fear. We sat there barely breathing, thinking this was it. We were in deep trouble. This creature, it had these glowing red eyes, and its face looked like something out of a nightmare. It let out a loud, guttural growl that sent chills down our spines. Benny, he had brought this flare gun for emergencies. He grabbed it and fired a shot into the sky. The creature let out a deafening howl and bolted into the darkness. We didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as dawn broke, we packed up and got the hell out of there. We didn't stop driving until we reached a small town. We went straight to a diner, ordered a ton of food, and over a cup of coffee, we talked about what we'd seen. The locals overheard us, and they didn't seem surprised. Some of them even started arguing about the local legends of a beast in the woods. Benny and I thought about reporting it, but decided against it. We just wanted to forget the whole experience. But I gotta tell you, it's hard to forget something like that. Sometimes I wonder if we should have continued our road trip. But who knows what that thing was capable of. Anyway, that's my story. Hard to believe, right? But I swear every word is true. I was chilling with my buddies at Goshen Pond up in good old New Jersey, near the Pinelands. We decided to go camping for some fun and adventure. And let me tell you, we were having a blast. Hiking, kayaking, swimming, you name it. Now it was around 7 or 8 in the evening, and we were all gathered around the campfire, cooking up some delicious grub and having a great time. The sun had just set, so it was getting pretty dark, but we could still see what was going on. We were joking, laughing, and fooling around when suddenly this horrendous smell hit us like a ton of bricks. I'm telling you, it was like someone had cracked open a bunch of rotten eggs right under our noses. The stench was so strong, we thought the meat we brought had gone bad. But when we checked, it was all fine. That's when it hit us that something was off. And then things got really quiet. You know that eerie silence in movies just before something bad goes down? Yeah, that's what it was like. It gave me the creeps, my friends too. And then, in the distance, we heard this weird, high-pitched scream. But let me tell you, it was no human scream. It was like nails on a chalkboard, making my blood run cold. Even now, just thinking about it gives me the heebie-jeebies. We all just froze, staring at each other around the campfire. One of my buddies suggested it could be some wild animal, like a coyote or a cat in distress. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't no ordinary critter. We scanned the tree line, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. We packed up our food real quick, just in case it was some wild animal on the prowl. Just as we were putting out the fire, we heard this strange beat, like soft drums pounding in the distance. It's hard to describe, but the sound kept getting louder and louder. We looked around trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. We thought maybe it was some other campers nearby, but boy, were we wrong. 'Cause right at that moment we saw it. I'm telling you, this thing was massive, at least 6 feet tall. And here's the kicker. My friends saw it too. I ain't making this up, I swear. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Huge wings, like a freaking giant bat. And those eyes, man, they were glowing red like hot coals. I could make out its scaly skin and those wicked hawked legs like a dang lizard. But the face, oh boy, the face was the freakiest part. It had a head like a goat, with a long snout and horns sticking out of its forehead. But get this, it had bat ears too. And its tongue, man, it was so long. When it screeched, I could see those razor-sharp canine teeth and those red, glowing eyes. They just pierced right through you. This thing, this demon or whatever it was, just hovered there in the air. I couldn't tell you exactly how long it stayed, but it felt like an eternity, even though it was probably just a few seconds. We were petrified, unable to move or look away, just locked in a gaze with those menacing red eyes. And then with another bone-chilling screech, it took off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Let me tell you, we didn't waste a second. We sprinted to our tents, desperately grabbing our phones to capture any evidence of what we had just witnessed. But by the time we were ready, that creature was long gone. It had vanished in the blink of an eye. We huddled together in one tent, seeking solace in each other's presence, but sleep was out of the question. The events of that night had shaken us to our core. The next morning, we couldn't avoid talking about it. And guess what? We had all seen the exact same thing. I know it sounds insane, like a flying goat bat demon straight out of a horror movie, but I swear on everything that is holy, it was real. We even thought about reporting it to the authorities, but how do you explain something like that? Hey, officer, we were out camping and this creature with wings and glowing red eyes paid us a visit. Yeah, like they'd believe us. We tried searching online for any similar sightings, but came up empty-handed. It was like we were the only ones who had encountered this monstrosity. And you know what's even worse? When we did talk about it with other people, they treated us like we were bonkers. They either thought we were crazy or accused us of making up stories. Since that night, things have changed for us. We're constantly on edge, more cautious than ever before. I avoid staying out after dark, and we all steer clear of wooded areas. No more camping, fishing, or hiking, especially if it's in the evening. We've become wary of the unknown, forever marked by that creature's evil presence. I'm grateful for the chance to share my story here. Maybe, just maybe, someone out there has experienced something similar. We can't be the only ones. It's high time we find some answers and unravel the mystery behind that nightmarish encounter, because deep down, I know what we saw was real, and there's a world beyond our understanding that holds untold secrets. I've always been intrigued by the mysteries that lurk beneath the surface of everyday life, and I appreciate that so many people are willing to share their experiences here. Back in my university days in the heart of London, I used to work part-time at a local library. It was a great gig, not only for the extra cash, but also because I had unlimited access to all the books I could ever want to read. One evening, we were about to close up, which involved tidying up the reading areas and preparing the library for the next day. I was working in the history section, which had a large window overlooking the park outside. Just outside the window was a small hill that offered a panoramic view of the park. I noticed that one of my colleagues had finished his work early and was standing at the top of the hill, seemingly captivated by something. The window was ajar, and I heard him calling out to us, urging us to come and see what he was witnessing. There were about 4 or 5 of us working that night, and we all made our way up the hill to see what had caught his attention. It was a clear summer night. The sky was dotted with stars, but one of them seemed too close and was moving in a peculiar manner. At first, we thought it might be a plane, but the way it was changing directions was too erratic. It would hover in one spot and then dart across our field of vision. We couldn't gauge its distance, but we were certain that no conventional aircraft could perform such maneuvers. After observing it for about 5 minutes, we tried to convince ourselves that it was some sort of optical illusion. We returned to the library to finish our closing duties. Once we were done, we went back up the hill to see if the object was still there. It was, and it seemed to be either brighter or closer. At this point, we decided to stick around and observe this anomaly. Some of us went back inside to grab some snacks while the rest of us sat on the hill, watching the object dart across the sky, hover in place, and drift slowly in different directions. It was unlike anything we had ever seen, and we all agreed that it seemed to be getting closer. Around the time our friends returned with the snacks, the object's light started to spiral. It was definitely getting closer and seemed to be heading towards the library. But then, it abruptly stopped in midair. Its light grew larger and larger. It seemed to be descending rapidly, but then it halted, changed directions entirely, and accelerated at an incredible speed in the opposite direction. We were spellbound. We ate our snacks and for some inexplicable reason decided to chase after the object to get a better look. We sprinted down the hill and across the park towards the light. It veered over the trees on the edge of the park and we followed it. The glow from the object was bright enough to illuminate the trees, so we didn't have to worry about stumbling over roots or undergrowth. We were all excited and shouting out theories about what it could be, but I think we were also trying to mask our nervousness. Suddenly, the object stopped and descended slightly above us, not directly overhead but close enough to startle us. It then just hovered there. It was low enough now that we could see 5 red circles on its underside. There were 2 circles positioned above 3 others, forming a trapezoid shape. It was emitting a loud, pulsating sound. After hovering for a couple of minutes, the light switched off, and it went completely silent. We could still see the silhouette of the object, a stark blackness against the night sky. After a few more minutes of hovering, it shot off over the horizon with the 5 red lights at the rear. It moved with the speed of a bullet, disappearing over the horizon in a matter of seconds. In the darkness, it resembled a short, stout triangle. Then there was nothing. We were all panting from the chase. As we stood there trying to comprehend what we had just witnessed, 2 fighter jets roared overhead at an extremely low altitude. A few minutes later, we saw multiple military aircraft and helicopters flying in the direction where the lights had disappeared. At that point, we all silently agreed to return to the library. Once we were back inside, we decided that regardless of what we had seen, whether it was some sort of military experiment or something truly bizarre, we didn't want to draw attention to ourselves. We certainly didn't want to mention it to our employer. So we all agreed not to discuss it. Of course, there was no mention of the incident on the news or anywhere else. I've thought about it often over the years. I still keep in touch with a couple of the guys I was with that night, and we all have the same recollection of what happened. I doubt we'll ever get any definitive answers about all the covert operations that must be happening out there, but I kind of hope to witness something like that again. I find myself constantly scanning the night sky just in case. I've been an avid hunter my entire life. Some of my fondest memories are of going on hunting trips in Michigan with my dad as a kid. He taught me so much, and we used to spend so much quality time together back in the day. I really miss him. Every time I go hunting now, the memories come pouring back, and I can still feel his presence with me. A few months ago, I went to his old hunting cabin deep in the woods on the 1-year anniversary of his death. It was my way of honoring him and thinking it would have been what he wanted. But I don't think he could ever prepare me for what I saw on that trip. I honestly figured I would be such an emotional mess that I wouldn't be able to get any real tracking done, and thought that it would just be good to get out there and think about all the good times we had together. But to my own amazement, I was able to track a nice 10-point buck that would walk right across one of our old deer stands. I figured it would be a great way to honor the old man, and I could make some nice venison backstrap like we used to do together. So I was out in the woods tracking the buck for a few hours, and I heard something big rustling around in the bushes. I thought it was the deer, but when I got closer, I saw something really strange. It was this huge animal that walked on its hind legs. This thing was super tall, like 7 feet tall, and it had these crazy glowing blue eyes. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was crazy. His face looked kind of like a wolf, but kind of looked demonic and sort of like a human, but not at the same time. It was a horrifying combination. It had hair all over its body and had big, bulging muscles. I guess I was in shock because I just stood there with my rifle and froze. I didn't know how to react, and I couldn't move. I was so freaked out. Then the beast looked right at me with its freaky blue eyes and sort of hunched over. We both froze and stared at each other for a good while. I couldn't tell which of us was more surprised, me or it. Then all of a sudden, the beast let out this wicked roar that sounded like multiple animals at once. It was awful, and it freaked me out so badly that I just unloaded the whole magazine of rounds at him. I'm not sure if I hit him or not, but thankfully it was enough to scare the beast off, and it took off into the woods. I got my bearings about me and ran back toward the cabin as quickly as I could. I slammed the cabin door shut and kept my rifle aimed at the door in case the beast wanted revenge. I spent pretty much the entire night like that, but luckily I didn't see the beast again that night. I was freaked out and didn't sleep a wink. The next morning I called up all my hunting buddies and described what I had seen, but they all told me I just had too many brewskis and didn't believe a word of it. I was freaked out, and I cut my hunting trip short and figured I'd done my daddy proud. I didn't catch a deer, but I stumbled across the scariest beast in all of America. That was one for the books. After I got home, I hopped on the World Wide Web and got to searching around on the internet to see if anyone else had seen something like what I had seen. Turns out I'm not the only one. I found a lot of information on something called the Michigan Dog Man. The physical description matches exactly what I saw. 7 feet tall, standing on its hind legs with huge muscles. Oddly enough, some of the people who have claimed to have seen the Dog Man claim it had orange eyes, and some claim it was blue like the one I had seen. I became pretty obsessed with it after that and read everything about the Dog Man that I could get my hands on. I went back to Dad's old cabin and checked all the trail cams to see if it had picked any pictures up. Sure enough, there was my 10-point buck taunting me, but I didn't get a single picture of the Dog Man. I set up cameras all over the place and have spent pretty much every weekend I can up in the cabin trying to find the Dog Man again. I've returned to the place where I first spotted him, but can't find any tracks or anything to lead me to him. The beast is elusive, but I'll spend the rest of my life tracking him down if I have to. I've always been a God-fearing man, but never believed in Bigfoot, UFOs, aliens, and all that kind of stuff. But seeing the Dog Man with my own 2 eyes has completely changed my mind about all of that. It made me realize how close-minded I've been my whole life. Just because it hasn't happened to me doesn't mean it hasn't happened to anyone else in the world. And the frustration I felt when trying to explain what I experienced to my best friends only to be shut down and ridiculed. That just ain't right. The truth is that we have no idea what's really out there, what's really going on. I've stopped watching the news because I now believe that the news that's being shoved down our throats is more like propaganda, trying to get us to think and behave in a certain way. The truth, I've found from my own experience, has been right in front of our eyes all along. We're just being programmed to not use our God-given sense and to just listen to whatever they want us to believe. We've all got a weird story, right? You've got one, don't you? I think everyone sees something they can't explain at least once in their life. Maybe for the most part, that happens when we're young. We come to terms with the encounter after telling ourselves that our undeveloped minds just didn't know how to process something. We invented an outlandish memory, or worse, deleted the experience from our minds entirely. Sometimes it happens after we've grown. We keep the story to ourselves or entrust it to our close friends. We share snippets of it with a therapist and listen closely as the encounter is broken down into more digestible parts. You agree with all that, don't you? Or am I just projecting? I thought that might be the case. Encounter kind of gives that away, doesn't it? Encounter says I met something, and not all of these stories begin like that. That is how my story begins. I met something. And that experience was in no way digestible, not before or after the therapy. You see, I have a lot of trust in my own mind. My line of work was intimately entwined with fields like physics and aerodynamics. I signed too many documents to say outright what kind of work I did, but I think you can imagine the usefulness of a mind like mine. You can imagine how an individual or an organization might want to apply those fields of study to the practical world. Anyways, I learned to trust my mind. It was the greatest muscle, refined and strengthened by years of study and application. To think that I just imagined the things I saw is just preposterous. One night I arrived home from work to find a cloud sitting above my home. It was too high in the atmosphere to be considered a blanket of fog, but it was low enough to appear strangely centered over my single-story suburban house. I looked at it, tilted my head, wondered aloud if the weather was going to take a turn for the worse, and then I forgot all about it. The low-hanging black cloud. My therapist would say that my memory was painting that moment to be more colorful than it could have been, more theatrical and exciting. The black cloud was a visual metaphor that I invented, according to them. It symbolizes the trauma and the looming dread. I remember taking off my coat that night. I remember washing the dishes from breakfast that morning and taking a shower before bed. I remember pulling the blanket up to my shoulder. Then I remember the sound of metal scraping against metal. I remember the tug of restraints around my wrists and ankles. They felt like warm leather, like a belt that had been laid out in the sun. I remember the cold, hard table underneath my back. I remember the bright lights blinking on and off overhead, playing with my senses like the poking of a stick. I remember the smell of chlorine and the faint burn that spread across my skin. I remember when the creatures stepped into frame. They sauntered into my peripheral vision and settled overhead. They were on top of me, looking down like a dentist might peer into an open mouth. I didn't feel any pain. I only felt the terror. I felt immeasurable fear as their large black eyes peered down at me. It seemed as though my body was being pulled in different directions, like they'd cut me open to puppeteer my bones. I was a little marionette on that table, dancing whichever way the creatures demanded. Their skin was gray. Their heads were engorged, swollen like water balloons. Their lips were thin and pressed shut throughout the entirety of the encounter. They never spoke. They never needed to. They seemed to communicate silently. I wondered if their mouths were so small for the same reasons that mankind's pinky fingers had shrunk over the years. They didn't need them anymore. They had a better way of speaking and a better way of breathing. I fixated on that question instead of on what was happening to my body. I couldn't endure that vulnerability. I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge that I had no idea what these creatures were doing to me. The lights blinked. I felt them swimming in my organs. Then I remember waking up in my bed. The interior of my house was destroyed, as if every piece of furniture had been raised to the ceiling and then dropped back down. I called my peers and not the police. I trusted the tests that they would perform more than what might be done at a hospital. They never let me see the results. They never let me resume my work either. Eventually, I shared that tragedy with my friends. I shared with my therapist. Like I said, they all have their theories. I invented the story to cope with the collapse of my career. I imagined the strange encounter when in reality someone very human had forced their way into my home and antagonized me while they were there. My favorite theory is that I'm willfully lying. Imagine that, will you? I'm so bored with my life that I've invented an excuse for everyone to call me a liar. I've purposefully given the world a reason to distrust me. I wish that were the case. I wish I could dismiss what happened as a dream. I wish I didn't still see that black cloud sometimes, hovering somewhere in the distance. I wonder if it's watching me or if it's moved on to someone else. Maybe I'm just seeing the next place it plans to attack. Maybe I should be warning people of what's to come when the storm cloud parks itself just above your roof. Maybe, but maybe not. What do you think? What responsibility do I have now after being turned away as a liar? I loved my car. I'm not sure how vain that makes me sound at the start of this story, but it's the truth. In fact, A few years ago, the only thing I would have said I loved more than my car was life itself. Can't drive if you're dead, right? I never thought I'd have to choose between the two. My 1960 Cadillac sedan DeVille with its dropped suspension and black chrome accessories, or my actual life. I'm embarrassed to say it, but the choice wasn't easy. Watching a monster tear apart the vehicle I'd pour my sweat, time, and savings into was probably harder than dying. I guess I'll never know for sure. The Cadillac helped me stand out from the rest of the rural Arizona community. It was part of a lifestyle and aesthetic that I guess I inherited from my father, who brought his particular taste to the farmland after moving from Los Angeles. Maybe I valued that even more than the chrome. That vehicle kept me connected to my dad. When it died, it was like losing him all over again. But I'm getting too sentimental. This story isn't about my father or the connection we failed to rebuild while he was still around. This story is about the beast. My neighbors are all miles away. We don't talk often, not unless there's an emergency. I heard whispers from them on a trip to town, rumors that the family to the south of my land had seen a strange animal skirting the edge of their pond. It was a hot summer, I told myself. Any creature with a tongue would be stopping by that pond, as it was the only source of fresh water for quite some distance. I didn't expect the opossums or the wild dogs to have a real grasp of drawing water from a well. They did describe the animal in a peculiar, though. They called it a naked bear. Now I'd seen pictures of starved and diseased bears online, so the image came to mind very quickly. But bears weren't exactly common in our area. I couldn't imagine what one would have been doing on our land. Looking back, I think it was just lost. Certainly that happens on rare occasions, right? I didn't take any stock in those stories. I went home as usual, parked my car in the usual spot in the shade of an old maple tree, and didn't bother to roll the windows. But I woke that night to the sound of the Cadillac's horn blaring. It bleated once and twice, loud enough both times to stir me from my bedroom, and then fell silent. I thought it might be some kids messing around with the car, so I ran out quickly and unprepared. But it wasn't a kid in my car. It was an animal that had scratched and clawed its way up and through the open window, crammed its sickly thin body through the narrow space just to get a closer look at the leather interior. I caught its body in the beam of my flashlight and I froze. It wasn't a naked bear, but I did understand the comparisons. It was the size of a large dog. Maybe it would have been bigger if it had any meat on its bones, and it did have a head that was vaguely ursine. The issue was the spines on its back, long and raised in a single row like a mohawk of bones. The issue was its tube-shaped tongue, which I saw unfurl and flop from its mouth like a butterfly's proboscis. The issue was its feet, which ended universally in sharp claws too long and too straight for any animal I'd ever known. They grew like knives instead of fingernails. They were knives which at the present moment were slicing through my seats like butter. I gasped and lurched forward and thought to open the door and start wrestling with the thing. The boils on its back made me pause. It wasn't a bear, but it was sick. Lesions grew around its shoulder blades, and its strange tongue was thick with a yellow mucus-like spit. I didn't want to deal with any part of that. Instead, I watched. It was burrowing into the seats like a squirrel carving out its next hiding place. Maybe it was building a nest, somewhere safe and warm for the night. I stood there with my heart in my throat until an idea came to mind. The inside of the car was ruined by then, but maybe I could still get the monster off of my property. I ran back inside and grabbed my keys, triggering the alarm on the Cadillac. The car wailed in a deafening blinking pattern. I couldn't help but think of it as the death throes of my lovely little vehicle. The shrieking was enough to send the monster into a frenzy. It jerked around the interior before spilling back out of the window and rolling to its feet. I watched it run clear off of my property, and then I stood and waited again. That time I was waiting for sunrise. I needed to assess the damage, but couldn't bring myself to do it with only a torch to light my way. When dawn broke, I cried. The interior could be replaced. The stink of the creature's saliva could have been washed out with enough attempts and enough conviction. The doors, where its claws had cleaved into the metal, could have been swapped for assembly line parts. But I felt like I was looking at a corpse. I loved that car. I wanted to protect it as though it was the last memory of my father, and instead I'd let it be destroyed. I parked it in a barn and left it there. Finding the monster became my priority, but I've never had success. The sick bear or the dog with the butterfly tongue, whatever you want to call it. Have you seen it? Because I owe that creature a world of punishment for the damage it did that night. I was born and raised in California, but my folks were originally from Maine. They moved to the West Coast for work shortly before tying the knot. I came into the picture about a year later. So every year we'd pack up the car and head back to Maine to hang out with my grandparents for a couple of weeks. Now, I've always been a fan of the hustle and bustle of city life, so the quiet countryside of Maine where my grandparents lived was a bit of a change for me. They were near the Canadian border, living in this snug little farmhouse that got pretty cramped when we all crammed in there, especially when my little brother and sister were born. The one year I didn't make it to Maine was when I was a junior in high school. I got to go to Japan for a school exchange program. And wouldn't you know it, my granddad, who we affectionately called Gramps, passed away about a month later. The rest of my family was there, so I felt comfort knowing they were with him towards the end. A week after Gramps' passing, we found ourselves driving back to Maine for the funeral. It was a long 9-hour drive, and I was with my brother in our car, while my sister tagged along with our parents. We got there late in the evening, had a home-cooked meal by Grams, and then pretty much everyone just crashed from the journey. The next day was the funeral. There was a small service at the local church that Gramps used to go to, and then the burial at the town cemetery, a good half-hour drive from Graham's house. Afterwards, Grams had folks over for a little get-together and lunch. I met many of their friends from around the area, and while they were a bit different from the city folks I was used to, everyone was genuinely nice. The drive and the funeral had taken a toll on me and my siblings, so after lunch we decided to go outside and get some fresh air. Grams and Gramps had a bit over 10 acres of land that led up to a pretty steep hill, not quite a mountain but close enough. It was filled with pine trees and looked really dense. Gramps had an old hunting cabin somewhere up there, and we decided to hike up to it for old time's sake. We hadn't been to the cabin since we were kids, so finding it was a bit of an adventure. It looked like Gramps hadn't been there in a while. But we ended up just chilling on the ground underneath the cabin, reminiscing about the good times with Gramps. We didn't always see eye to eye as siblings, but Gramps' passing made us put our differences aside. As my brother Jake was chatting about wanting to visit Japan like I did, we heard this weird thump. We looked around, puzzled, but then everything went quiet again, and we resumed our conversation. But then bam, 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 4 more thumps in quick succession. To me, it sounded like rocks being thrown against trees. My sister Lucy stood up immediately, saying she wanted to head back to the house. I could tell she was a little spooked. We were about a 15-minute walk deep into the woods. I tried to stay cool as I got up, but I noticed that the woods were eerily quiet. No chirping of birds or rustling of squirrels, which is usually a sign of a larger predator nearby. Gramps taught us that when we were kids, but I wasn't sure if Jake or Lucy remembered. Trying to keep Lucy calm, I started guiding us back the way we came, all the while chattering about anything and everything I could think of. Jake was starting to look a bit uneasy, too. Then he stopped dead in his tracks, pointed and said, "Moose?" But it sounded more like a question than a statement. What he was pointing at was hunched over and a dark brown color. Not like any moose I'd ever seen before. It was massive, bigger than a horse for sure. And as we watched it, the creature stood up. I realized it was standing on 2 legs and was looking right at us, but instead of the long snout and antlers I was expecting, the face was eerily human-like. Still covered in fur, but with a human nose and ears. It was maybe 200 feet away. Lucy took off running without a second thought, and Jake and I were right behind her. We sprinted back to the house and burst through the front door. Grams must have seen us from the window because she immediately asked us what was wrong. Lucy was too shaken to speak, but I tried my best to explain what we saw, even though I knew it sounded absolutely bonkers. To my surprise, Gramps didn't seem fazed at all. She mentioned that Gramps used to talk about seeing those things in the woods. Apparently, there were a few of them, but they usually kept to the deeper parts of the hill. She mused, "I wonder if they knew he's gone and came down to pay their respects." As crazy as it sounded at the time, as I've grown older, I find myself wondering the same thing. My name is Mike, and I'm a city boy, born and raised in New York. But I got this wild idea back in the 80s to visit California, specifically the Redwood National Park. No one else was ever available to join me, so I figured, why not take a solo trip? So off I headed in June of 1988. So I'm there, in the heart of the park, surrounded by these towering trees. I'm walking along this trail, completely lost in the beauty of it all. But before I know it, the sun's starting to set and I'm nowhere near the main trail. I try to backtrack, but everything looks the same in the dimming light. I'm starting to panic a bit, but I try to keep my cool. Then, out of nowhere, I spot this figure up ahead. It's small, like a kid, but there's something off about it. It's got this long, slender neck that seems to stretch on forever. Its skin is pale, almost luminescent in the fading light, and it's covered in these strange, scaly patches. And its eyes, man, they're this deep, unsettling red. They're staring right at me, and I swear it feels like they're looking into my soul. Despite the fear creeping up my spine, I decide to follow it. I'm desperate, and I figure maybe this thing can help me find my way back. I follow it for a bit, and it keeps stopping quickly to look back at me like it wants me to follow it. But then, out of nowhere, the ground just disappears from under me. I'm falling, and it feels like it's happening in slow motion. I land hard, and when I open my eyes, I'm in this dark cave, and I'm not alone. There are these things staring at me. They look like skulls, but they're moving like they're alive, and they're all around me, watching me. I'm terrified, but I can't move, can't scream, and then everything goes black. When I wake up, I'm back in the forest, not far from the main trail. I have no idea how I got there, but I don't stick around to figure it out. I hightail it out of there, swearing all along that I'll never set foot in a forest again. I mean, I was shaken. Who wouldn't be? I had just had the most terrifying experience of my life. But I was also confused. What was that creature that wanted me to follow it? And those skull-like things, were they real? Or was I just hallucinating? I needed to get out of the forest, away from the trees. I needed to be around people, even if I didn't feel like talking. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning in my hotel room, unable to shake the image of those red eyes and the eerie glow of the cave. The next day, I decided to do some research on the area, so I went to the local library and started looking up local legends and folklore. I figured maybe there was some sort of explanation for what I had seen. I spent hours poring over old books and newspaper articles, but I couldn't find anything that matched my experience. Feeling defeated, I decided to head back to the hotel. But as I was leaving the library, I noticed a small, dusty book on an end cap with other titles about the area. The title was barely legible, but I could make out the words, Redwood Mysteries. I opened the book and started flipping through the pages. Most of it was just old tales of gold miners and lumberjacks, but then I came across a chapter titled The Guardians of the Forest. It told a story of ancient beings that were said to protect the forest and its inhabitants. They were described as having long necks, scaly skin, and deep red eyes. My heart started pounding as I read the description. It was eerily similar to the creature I had seen. The story went on to say that these beings were rarely seen by humans, but when they were, it was usually a sign of a major change or event. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just a coincidence? Or had I really encountered one of these guardians of the forest? And if I had, what did it mean? What was this major change the book was talking about? I spent the rest of my trip trying to find answers, but I never got anywhere with it. In the end, I returned to New York with more questions than I had when I left. But one thing was for sure, my trip to California was one I would never forget. I always thought I was lucky to have a son who took an interest in my work. I didn't find the life of a park ranger to be particularly glamorous, so when he started asking questions about my job, I was surprised. It wasn't long after that when we started camping together, going on hikes, and immersing ourselves in the wilderness. I shared my knowledge as best I could. I taught him how to spot tracks in the spring and summer. I taught him how to build a fire in the fall and winter. He was prepared, I thought, although I didn't know exactly what for. Maybe he'd follow in my footsteps and spend his weeks patrolling our nation's great national parks. Maybe he'd pass that knowledge down to his own kids when the time came. I was wrong about a lot of things. He wasn't prepared, not really, and neither of us were lucky. When the thing in the woods crossed our path, each of us realized just how dangerous these parks really are. There are no manuals, no amount of training, and no weapons that can prepare you for the secrets Mother Nature still hides. We were setting up camp. Dusk was fast approaching. We'd picked out a pretty clear spot surrounded by fir trees. There weren't any tracks nearby, and there were no signs of nesting, either in our area or in a 15-foot radius around our site. We thought we were in the clear. We'd be lucky to see a passing deer. Before we could even erect our tents, though, the knocking started. We listened at first, trying to silently decide if we were hearing something natural. Sometimes you'll hear a buck grinding their antlers against a smaller tree. This sound was more unique. It was rhythmic. There was an undeniable pattern to it, something intelligent. It wasn't Morse code, but it felt similar, like the distant knocks were speaking in a language that we just didn't know. So we called out. We went looking. My son was 13 and intelligent enough to hang back or to run if he needed to, but we were both convinced that we were hearing the efforts of a man or woman stuck in the area nearby. They could have been trapped, injured, or malnourished. They couldn't speak, that much was clear, but we believed they were asking for help. The average person wouldn't know Morse code. They'd just be making whatever noises they could to get somebody's attention. They had our attention at least, but they weren't human. We agreed on the direction the sounds were coming from, and we moved toward it. After walking maybe a dozen feet outside of our camp's perimeter, the knocking abruptly ended. We heard something scrape past the trees, like thick fur tangling in dry branches. That sound passed us like birds on the wind, quick and fluttering. We tried to turn our heads and follow the sounds as they ran around us, but we couldn't make out the shape of whatever was out there. It was moving too quickly to be a man. We stood back to back, turning in a circle to keep our eyes on the woods. I remember seeing goosebumps on my son's arms. They matched the hairs standing up on my own neck. We both felt the same way. We'd stumbled into a trap of some kind. We were being hunted. Our only chance, I thought, was to make ourselves look big. Don't show any fear. Make it look like the meat on our bones wouldn't be worth the fight. Then my son spotted the thing in the trees. He screamed and pointed. My eyes followed his finger. It was twice the size of either of us. Approaching 8 feet tall with a hunch in its back that meant it was probably even taller, standing on 2 feet. Covered in the exact fur that I had imagined, thick and matted in the color of the autumn leaves, I'd never seen an animal so wide. My son and I standing shoulder to shoulder barely matches the width of its chest. It stood there, half hidden by the fur, and just watched. It glared at us, chewing on its lip like a daydreaming child. Its brow jutted out, and its forehead was tall and narrow. It looked like an ape of some kind. Its long arms nearly scraped the ground, even from its upright position. It was hard not to imagine those arms tearing through the trees around us. Our bodies would break even easier than that. It took in one more big breath, filling its lungs to the brim. I flinched when I thought it might roar. But then, the beast turned and ran away. It disappeared back into the woods. leaving both of us with wide eyes and open mouths. That was the first time my son asked a question about the woods that I couldn't answer. That was the first time I even considered that we might be in danger out there in the trees. How could we prepare for that? How could we sleep soundly, knowing that it was out there watching us? That night, we didn't. We packed up and drove all night to crawl back into our own beds. We haven't gone camping since either. We haven't visited the trails. Unfortunately for me, I haven't seen the beast again, even after volunteering for more work with the parks. I wanted to get a picture of it. I wanted to have evidence that someone could point to and proclaim, "I know what that is." After that, I figured I might feel safe again. I might go back out there with my kid. The woods might be our special place again, but I'm starting to think that will never happen. There are no answers for these kinds of things, are there? There's no one coming along to explain what we encountered. We heard the howling for weeks. Before that, it was the shrieking of our chickens at 4 in the morning. The animals always heard it coming long before we did. We learned to listen for those chickens. We listened for the cows in their stalls. We listened for our old bloodhound, who would anxiously pace the halls with one eye glued to the front door. We always thought that was funny. Whatever it was outside, we never expected it to come through the front door. We never expected it to come to the house at all. That shows how little we knew, huh? The howling started in the summer, early June. It was so far away the first night that we mistook it for the wind. We thought a dry thunderstorm might be coming in from the west, the same direction as the forest at the edge of our farmland. When the wind and thunder ripples through those trees, the forest makes all sorts of unholy sounds. We thought the howls were the same sort, terrifying in nature but harmless in reality. That was another mistake. Each night the sounds got closer. On the first night, our hound had merely pointed her ears toward the window. The next night she faced the glass and growled. Then the pacing began. By that third night, it was as the thunder had descended on just our farm. The howls were deafening. They occurred so late in the night that we had no hopes of preparing for them. We tried to stay up to spot whatever was out there for ourselves, but each time our old age caught up to us and lulled us to a bitter sleep. 4 a.m., almost like clockwork, we'd wake to a disturbance. We'd run to the door, sometimes armed and sometimes not, rushing into the porch to yell at our mysterious intruder. They were always gone. The bestial shrieking would always end the moment we opened the door. The cows would murmur and quiet down. The chickens would clean their feathers. What could we do, we wondered? How could we trap this thing? How could we get our eyes on it in order to understand just what we were dealing with? We didn't come up with any genius plan. We hired back one of our old farmhands, a sturdy boy with a military past that he rarely spoke about. We described what we were dealing with, and he agreed to sit up on our porch, waiting for the beast to come. We thought that would settle it. We knew he was a crack shot with a rifle. We knew he wouldn't scare easy. That night, the howling was louder than ever before. It wasn't loud enough to hide that man screaming. While the howl was low and as smooth as the breeze, our farmhand's cries were sharp, piercing, and erratic. He was attacked. We were sure of it. No man would scream like that unless they were being ripped apart. When we joined him on the porch, however, it was clear that the man was in one piece. As before, when we opened the door, the invader fled. Our guard stood trembling on the porch, skin as white as bone and eyes as wide as a flower in the sun. It didn't make sense to us then, but he was rambling about a man. We thought whatever he'd seen must have triggered some dormant memories from his time in the military. There was no way that the howling we'd heard was made by a human being. That was our last night with a guard on our porch. We recommitted ourselves in that moment to spot the creature on our own. As terrified as our farmhand was, we were relieved to know that thus far the monster had yet to attack any of our livestock. Initially, we wanted to protect our land. We wanted to repel the invader. Something about the farmhand's encounter steered us closer toward morbid curiosity. We didn't think we were in danger. We just wanted to know. We wanted to solve the mystery that had rolled across our farm like a cloud of fog. We sat on our porch with a pot of coffee and a checkers board between us. We made it to 2 a.m. We woke yet again to the ruckus. This time the fence around our chickens was groaning and spitting, bending and breaking under some immense pressure. We chased the sound. The howling was a whimper. When we finally cornered it, we saw the beast was snared by the fractured ends of our own fence. The farm itself had caught the invader, not us. Now its arm was pinned by 2 planks of snapped wood. We had spent weeks waiting for this moment, and now that it was upon us, we were as insignificant as the hens anxiously pattering on the other side of the fence. The beast was in front of us. Now what? We were baffled for one simple reason. The farmhand had been right. We were looking at a man. His back was engorged, swollen, and curved to the point that his spine appeared to be shaped like a scythe. From head to toe, he was covered in thin, wiry fur. He snarled when he looked at us. Spit ran from his lips to his chin. His teeth were pointed, more canine than primate. What were we looking at? We raised our rifle and took aim. We had to be rid of this beast after all. Then, behind us, true thunder finally cracked in the cruelest dry storm of the season. It cracked like a whip, and we jumped out of our skin expecting there to be another monster behind us. We turned, misfired the weapon, and stumbled. The beast tore itself free. It ran. We fired another shot but missed. It stayed away from our farm after that. Our hound still paces the hallways when the summer rolls in. But we haven't heard the howl in years. What about you, I wonder? Have you heard anything like this before? Have you seen it? This is a short story about something strange that happened in our house, and I'm really curious to hear what you make of it. So, my partner, Alice, and I, we live in this pretty old house in a residential neighborhood of Missouri. It's one of those houses that has seen a fair share of decades and has some pretty interesting architectural details, you know? It's got these tall ceilings and these big, old-fashioned windows, and it just oozes character. Anyway, we live on the ground floor. That's going to matter later. So about 6 months after we moved in, we were getting the place ready for Christmas. You should know, Alice and I, we're big on holidays. We love the whole shebang, decorating the tree, hanging stockings, the works. One evening we were watching some Christmas movies on the TV. You know, those Hallmark ones that are just the right kind of cheesy. It was getting late, around 9 p.m., so we decided to switch off the porch light and head to bed. Now our house, it's got this quaint little foyer right as you enter. There's a staircase on the right that leads up to our neighbor's place, and our front door is just across from the main entrance. And then there's this door next to the staircase that leads to the cellar. When we first moved in, Alice and I had taken a look at the cellar. It was pretty spacious and old with all these corners and crevices. The cellar door, it's got this old latch on it. One of those that you have to slide and fit into a groove. We always keep it locked unless the landlord tells us that someone's coming for maintenance. So on this particular Christmas Eve, Alice and I were heading to bed when we hear the main door into the foyer creak open. It was odd because our neighbors were away for the holidays and the door was locked. Alice went over and peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. We shrugged it off as maybe just the wind or something and went back to bed. But then, just as we were about to turn in, we noticed that the cellar door was ajar. Just a little, maybe an inch or so. But it was strange. It was locked when Alice checked the foyer earlier. We decided to check it out, just to be on the safe side. The cellar was empty and cold, just as it should be. We locked the door again and went back to bed. The next morning, when we were heading out for a walk, we noticed the cellar door was open again. Alice was sure she had locked it. She even texted our neighbor asking if they had come down for some reason. But they were still away, remember? They made some joke about us having a Christmas ghost. We tried to laugh it off and went about our day, but that night the cellar door was wide open again, And I mean so wide open that it was blocking our front door. Both of us a little freaked out, we decided to check the cellar again, but it was empty. We've checked multiple times since then and haven't found anything or anyone. But every single night, no matter how tightly we lock it or what we put in front of it, the cellar door just keeps opening. Maybe our neighbors were onto something with their ghost joke, because there's no way for the latch to just pop open on its own. We're hoping that once our landlord puts a proper lock on the door, this all stops. But if it doesn't, well, I guess I'll be writing to you again with an update. I mean, if it is a ghost, I hope it's a friendly one. Given the holiday season and all, a ghost of Christmas past, maybe? Anyway, fingers crossed, right? So here's a thing that happened to me when I was just a kid. We were living in this tiny place in Nevada, not too far from Nellis Air Force Base. Our house was on the west side of town, and there was this big desert area right behind our backyard. Kind of cool place for a kid, you know? My friends and I used to spend hours out there, chasing lizards and pretending to be explorers. Anyway, one evening, my dad had just come home from work, and I heard him call out to me from the yard. His voice had this weird tone. I was the eldest, and my younger siblings were already in bed, so I was wondering what's up. I could feel that he was uneasy about something more than just needing help with his toolbox. My first thought was that he'd spotted a rattlesnake or something, because we'd been seeing them around lately. So I rushed outside, and he pointed at something that was hovering over the desert area, kind of southwest of our house. He was like, "Can you make out what that thing is?" You see, I was pretty familiar with all sorts of aircraft. My grandpa had been taking me to every air show possible since I was just a kid, and my uncle worked as an engineer at Boeing. But this thing my dad was pointing at, it was making a sound like a far-off lawnmower. Not at all the kind of sound you'd expect from a helicopter hovering at that distance. I had seen my fair share of helicopters, and this wasn't one of them. And we lived around planes, both civilian and military. This thing was not moving, and it looked to be about the size of a school bus. It was hard to make out its exact shape, but I could swear it was circular, and it had this weird glow. The light was a soft blue, and it was flickering almost like it was breathing. It reminded me of the way a flashlight's beam dances on the wall of a dark room. It just hung there in the air, as if it was spotlighting something beneath it. After we watched it for a few minutes, it began to drift slowly. The noise got a bit louder, but not as much as you'd expect from something that big that was hovering and moving slowly. The thing followed the course of the desert, west. It passed close to our house, and then we lost sight of it as it drifted behind a sand dune. We walked around the south side of the house to try and catch sight of it again as it crossed the last few houses in our street. We saw it follow the desert path, about 50, 60 feet above the ground. It still wasn't making a lot of noise. But then, just like that, in the blink of an eye, the light went from in front of us to hovering over the neon lights of Las Vegas, way off in the distance. A quick Google search will tell you that's over 30 miles. The crazy thing is, at that point, there was no noise at all. It was just silent. Yet it had accelerated instantly. It covered those 30-something miles in the fraction of a second. We watched it the whole time, not believing what we were seeing. It then hovered over the city for about half a second. Then it shot straight up at the same speed it had crossed the desert. And then we lost sight of it in the night sky as it ascended straight up. The stars are always bright at night in that part of Nevada. I remember as it went up, it lost that glow and changed to a bright blue that got brighter and brighter. It kind of looked like a firework that didn't explode, but it went much higher and faster. The next morning on the school bus, I told the kids from the end of our street about what my dad and I had seen. They all laughed at me, and I was the joke for the next couple of days. I was kind of a weird kid, you know, more into books and stargazing than sports. The subject didn't come up again until maybe a year later when I got a bit more popular and ended up being friends with one of those kids. Turned out he and his family had seen the same thing, but he had been too embarrassed to admit it in front of the others on the bus, especially after the way they had all reacted. His parents had even told him not to talk about it because people would think they were crazy. This was all back in the late 90s. I went on to study aerospace engineering and have had the chance to work on some classified projects involving aircraft and other military tech. Even spent some time as an analyst in the U.S. Air Force, focusing on studying equipment imagery, understanding their functions and capabilities, and providing that information for operational needs. And let me tell you, nothing moves like that thing moved. Nothing we have, nothing anyone has. I know some will choose to believe me, and others won't. I'm certain about what I saw, but I don't think I'll ever get a satisfactory explanation for my encounter. In the heart of the bustling city, I had an encounter that forever altered my perception of urban life. I was around 13 or 14 at the time, living in a high-rise apartment in New York City. Every summer, my parents would send me to a week-long summer camp in the city's eastern district. The camp was an urban adventure theme, offering activities like rock climbing, archery, group games, and rooftop sing-alongs. The camp had 3 types of accommodations. The first was the penthouse suites, reserved for the older kids. The second was the loft apartments, akin to large open spaces with high ceilings. The third was the rooftop tents where I was staying. The rooftop tent was a single-room structure, perched on the top of a high-rise building, surrounded by a 3-foot barrier to prevent anyone from falling off. It was open to the elements, but a slanted canvas roof protected us from rain. Each accommodation was about a quarter-mile apart, giving a sense of seclusion. Our group consisted of a counselor and about 6 kids. On the last night of camp, I was struggling to fall asleep. The city lights were unusually bright, and the sounds of the city were more noticeable than ever. I lay there lost in my thoughts when I began to notice a distinct sound that gradually became more distinguishable from the usual city noises. It sounded like faint rustling, but as the sound grew closer, I could tell that something was moving across the rooftops. I started listening closer, feeling a little nervous. The sound was getting progressively louder, and it started sounding like the noise was being made by the footsteps of a person rather than an animal. It was approaching from the south, which led towards the depths of the city, instead of from the north, where the camp facilities were located. That definitely made me think that it wasn't a counselor or someone coming to alert us of something. When I realized that, my curiosity changed to fear. I tried to roll over as quietly as I could to sit up and take a look over the barrier. As I did, I heard a slight rustling sound coming from my left. The other kids were still asleep, but I saw that the counselor who was sleeping with us in the rooftop tent was awake. He had rolled over in his cot to grab my attention when he saw that I was about to get up. He held up his hand to signal me to stop as soon as we made eye contact. I did what he told me and laid back down. I was just holding my breath and listening as hard as I could. The footsteps had stopped, which made me even more nervous since I had no idea where the thing was. Then I heard a strange sound that was like flapping. The counselor got out of his cot as quietly as he could, and I couldn't help myself. I followed him. As soon as we looked over the barrier, we saw this bizarre creature swoop out of the sky and land on the rooftop below us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen or heard of before. It was tall, dark, and winged, with glowing red eyes that shone in the darkness. It was like me and the counselor were just frozen there. And as we were staring down, the creature looked up and locked eyes with me. I don't know how to explain it, but I almost felt as if it had been seeking me out specifically. The creature didn't move, and it was like it was just studying us with this piercing gaze that felt like it went right through us. The silence then was almost deafening, and I was barely breathing, waiting for it to make its next move. And then it spread its wings and took off, soaring up into the city's skyline and disappearing in the darkness. We were basically just paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do next. We stayed huddled in the rooftop tent for the rest of the night. There was no way we were going to venture anywhere not knowing where that thing had gone, And we didn't want to wake up the others and have a full-blown panic going on. At least it was only a couple hours until sunrise. And when it got light enough and everyone woke up, the counselor just calmly as possible herded us all to where the main camp was and settled us in the dining area. He ordered us to stay put while he went and talked to the camp director. The other kids didn't know what was going on, and I just did not want to talk about it at all. There was such a weird mood in the camp that morning while we waited for our parents to pick us up. It was a complete contrast to the usual last-day shenanigans that would usually be going on. I don't know what the counselors told the parents. I did tell my mom and dad what I had seen. It's hard to know what they really thought. From that day on, I never looked at the city in the same way again. I had experienced something that hardly anyone would believe, and it really changed me.